Hey guys, LC Holt here. And this is my update for the week of October the 14th. Rebecca Ivey, seated over here, joining me as usual. And do you know what we're going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about the life and the mysterious disappearance of a man named James Riddle Hoffa. James Riddle Hoffa.
What a middle name. How
I tell you.
fitting.
It was actually his mother's maiden name.
Okay.
He was born February 14th, 1913, in a town called Brazil, Indiana. Do you know that there was a Brazil in Indiana?
I did not.
Now you do. And he had, his parents were John Hoffa and Viola Riddle Hoffa. Father actually died in 1920 when he was just 7. So it was pretty much him and his mother, and he had to kind of work to support her. The family moved in 1924 to Detroit, Michigan. And he spent the remainder of his life pretty much in Detroit, Michigan. But like I said before, he had to support his mother, being the man of the house now. So he had to take a lot of menial jobs, manual labor jobs, which were very, very difficult. He worked for a long time for a grocery chain. And it was tough because the work conditions were not great and they had to work long hours for very, very little pay. But eventually, I think he here's the deal. Jimmy was very good at organizing people. He was a good talker. And being a very small child and growing into a relatively small man, if you've ever seen him standing next to anybody, he was not a man of great height. He had to learn early on to be like a fighter.
Mm-hmm.
And this killer instinct that he developed came to help him out like quite a bit in life. And when he saw people getting run over, people including himself as a young boy, by employers who could basically dictate their own, terms. In other words, look, we just need a hired hand to load some boxes. Well, we're going to pay you what we want to pay you, and you're going to like it. And if we ever get tired of you, we'll get rid of you and we'll hire somebody else. And you don't need benefits and stuff like that. Why would you need that? You're just loading boxes. Well, pretty early on, Jimmy recognized that this was not fair for himself or for the people around him. And he started to get them together, even when he worked for this grocery store, and demand that they get the rights that they deserve and the pay that they deserve. This did not go over too well, but he stayed in that job for quite a while. He stayed there until, when was it?
Well, he left in 1932.
Right.
He left the grocery store and he became an organizer for the local 299 with the Teamsters in Detroit.
Yes. So that already pretty early on, he's seeing that he can organize people, and other people are recognizing this about him. He was really a man of the people. He got out there. There were stories about him standing on the side of the road, and a truck would drive by, and he would pretend like he was hitchhiking, and then they would pick him up, and he'd get in the cab with the driver, and he'd start talking to him because he had the gift of the gab. He never met a stranger, Jimmy Hoffa, and so he could just relate to people. And since he started on the bottom, he could relate to just ordinary Joes in the way, their buddies down at the tavern would relate to them. And they would talk and stuff. And then after he sort of developed a rapport, he would say, well, listen, I'm a recruiter for the Teamsters. And he'd pull out a card and give it to him. Now, a lot of times the drivers would be like, oh, no, wait. Let's stop the boat right there. Because they know that if their employer gets wind of this union activity, or that they were even thinking about joining a union, it could quite literally cost their job.
Mm-hmm.
And they had families to support. And so a lot of times, he would leave them with a card, and he would get out of the truck, back onto the side of the road, and he'd wait for the next truck driver to come by. And he'd do this all night, night after night after night. And that's how he made so many connections. And it also was a way for him to relate to people on a very human level, which is something he was a big believer in. He thought that, every person that you could relate to is a person that you might be able to recruit. Now, so it started out very grassroots, and he worked his way up, essentially. So in 1932, like you said, he became a full-time organizer for the local 299. A few years after that, 1936, he met a woman who worked in a laundry.
Always laundry.
Always laundry. And we know that when we talk about laundries, like industrial laundries, like where Josephine worked, these were sweatshops. Mm-hmm. Women would have to literally stand there for hours and hours and hours. They would, work till their hands were calloused. A lot of the chemicals would make the skin peel off. Not an easy job. And when you say sweatshop, it really was a sweatshop. You were pretty much slave labor. And so I think probably, Jimmy saw a way that he could get Josephine out of that kind of life. So in Bowling Green, Ohio, they married. She was 18 at the time. And they went on to have 2 children. They had a daughter named Barbara, and they had a son who was also named James Philip Hoffa. And, by all accounts, he was a very loving father. He was a great, family man. People used to say that Jimmy had such a big bark, and he had a pretty big bite. But when he would come home, Josephine would be like, okay, we need to get the trash out. We need to clean this. The car needs to be washed. And he would hop to it, because Josephine ruled the roost when Jimmy was at home. And Jimmy ruled the roost when he was over at the Teamsters local office. So, yeah. Now, a little background on the Teamsters. In 1933, we'll just use that as a point of reference. The Teamsters had 75,000 members. They had been around since 1903. So they'd been around, say in 1933, for instance, they'd been around 30 years. Okay, they had 75,000 members. Thanks to Hoffa and his ability to work on the grassroots level, in just a few years, 1936, in 3 years, they had 170,000 members. So 100,000 more members. So it took them 30 years to get 75,000.
Just think if that man had Instagram.
Man, I tell you, I think Jimmy would love it. He would love it. But listen to this. So 3 years after that, guess how many people they had? They went from 170,000 members to 420,000 members. And by the start of the 1950s, they had over 1 million. Because one thing Jimmy Hoffa could do, one of many things he could do, was he could win people's confidence. Because you just believed him. You knew that he had come from nothing. And what he was saying was like the gospel.
Yeah.
And people had a lot of trust in him. And maybe at this time, the trust was warranted. I think maybe later you could argue that he misused some of that trust. Now, the Teamsters originally started in the Midwest and, organizing truck drivers and warehouse workers. Jimmy perfected through his years, certain things, certain tactics that he would use to get employers on board with what the workers wanted. Strikes were a big part of this. He loved to organize a good strike. And a boycott. He was the king of boycotts, this guy. And that's a way he could get these employers over a barrel in these contract negotiations. He would actually tell people, we're going to walk the line. Don't you dare cross it. And we're going to stand up. And I don't care if they come out with billy clubs and beat us. We're going to stand up for ourselves. And you know what they did? They came out with billy clubs and beat them. But ultimately, they never walked away. And so that's how these contract demands were finally met. There were stories about how Jimmy would come home from one of these strikes where, the cops sort of enforcers came out and beat him up. He would come home and there'd be gashes in his head and blood running down his face. And Josephine would patch him up and he'd go right back out with a big bandage on his head to stand with the workers some more. And, get back on his soapbox and then preach to the masses. So in all of these kind of regards, I have a great admiration for him. Now, I don't admire him in all ways, because as we're going to get on in this story, things got a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
And I think one of the ways to start getting into that is by saying that the trucking companies at that time, a lot of them had affiliations or were flat out owned by organized crime. And it was a way, that started with Prohibition. It was a way of getting illegal liquor back and forth across the country. That was only one of the things that they would illegally carry. So what Jimmy discovered is that in order to really get what he wanted for the people, he had to, should I say, make a deal with the devil? That may be a little bit dramatic. But he had to learn how to finagle with organized crime members and or bosses. And sometimes he was so good at doing that, he could actually get them to come out and protect them. They would have organized crime affiliated enforcers that would stand on the line. And when the people came out with the billy clubs, these mob guys would whip out some guns and knives and some shit of their own, and they'd help Jimmy fight back the police or whoever else were trying to get him to.
So Josephine didn't have to mend as many gashes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. But sort of an interesting thing talking about Jimmy and truckers.
He never was a truck driver.
Never was a truck driver. And in spite of that, he climbed, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He actually becomes the president of the local 299 in 1946, December 1946, actually. After that, he leads several combined Teamster groups and then becomes head of Michigan Teamsters.
So he rose quickly.
So yeah, he
was always able to talk his way into another good position. But he showed results, which is what people liked.
Yeah.
And look at them, like I was saying before, reading you the numbers of how the membership just grew exponentially as soon as he became.
And I'm sure, like, getting in bed with the mob, as they say.
Yeah, it doesn't hurt.
It did not hurt his.
I'll tell you this. I'd like to get your opinion on this.
Okay.
So World War II broke out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy Hoffa actually got a deferment to not fight in WW2 because he said that he would be better served, or he'd be better serving the nation if he stayed back and kept the truck lines running during wartime. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a legitimate thing, or do you think you should have gone off and fight with the rest of the boys?
Well, I could see why the government would be like, well, we need the trucks to transport goods and all that stuff. And if you can make it work, then, that's a very important part of our effort. That's
true. Yeah. And, I think that that's fine. I'm sure he just didn't, some part of him, he just didn't want to go to war.
Yeah.
But it's as good an excuse as any, I suppose. Now, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, that's the larger organization. Mm-hmm. They had a president named Daniel Tobin.
Yes, and he had been president since 1907.
Yes.
And he was the longest running president up until then, or is he
still?
He's still, okay.
Still to this day. He is the longest serving, because the president of the Teamsters, they have 5-year terms.
Okay.
So you're elected president of the Teamsters, you serve for 5 years, and then you're up for re-election.
He's like their FDR, right?
Yeah.
He's the one that got the most.
Yeah, he's the one that stuck around. And and he stuck around until a guy named Dave Beck came along. Now, Hoffa got behind Dave Beck in a big bad way. And he worked for David Beck, and he spoke for David Beck, and he would stand up at these rallies, and he actually helped David Beck turn the tide against the long-running Teamsters president. He instilled a certain amount of, he made the people think maybe we should move on to a new face. And so, 1952, remember, Tobin had been president of the Teamsters since 1907. 1952, Tobin finally loses the presidency to David Beck.
45 years.
45 years he was president of the Teamsters. Isn't that amazing?
It's crazy.
I don't know if that record's going to be beaten. There's one person that might beat it, but we'll talk about that later. Do you know who David Beck appointed his vice president? Can you guess?
Oh, is it Jimmy?
It's Jimmy. Jimmy earned that vice presidency.
Yes,
I'll tell you what,
like it.
because he got up there and he did his full Jimmy Hoffa thing for Mr. Beck, and it worked. And since everybody was all the workers, man, were on Jimmy Hoffa's side, they were like, Jimmy's telling us this, we need to change. We're going to change, and so they did. Now, a couple years after that. 3 years after, in 55, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters home office moved for the first time from Indianapolis to Washington, D.C., which put them more on the radar of lawmakers.
Yeah.
Which maybe was not a great thing, or maybe it was a good thing. I don't know. You could probably go both ways depending on where your sympathies fall.
Yeah.
I myself am I'm kind of a union guy. I'll be honest with you. I think if a corporation can take advantage of its employees, they will do so with a big old smile on their face. So it's not bad to have somebody to stand up for the average worker, and make sure that they can't just be fired because the wind blew the wrong way. So, a lot of people have talked about corruption, and we're about to get into some corruption. But I think that when you have any organization of any kind,
you start getting that power.
You start getting power and money, there will be corruption. So to just flat out say unions are corrupt, I think is disingenuous, because by and large, they do good things for workers. Now, I can speak from being a part of the Screen Actors Guild. Like, Screen Actors Guild have gotten me monies that I never would probably have seen. Because the production company or a studio is not just they don't want to throw money at you. I mean, it is a business. So it is good to have someone who will look after you and do an audit, an arbitration if you need to see if you're actually getting the monies that you're entitled to. So perhaps I'm a little bit biased, but I do think unions by and large are a good thing. Now, back to the matter in hand, Jimmy Hoffa. He started to travel a lot after the move from Indianapolis. He was away from home and his family quite a bit because they wanted him and his mouthpiece out on the road, getting people pumped up. Around this time, he got himself an attorney named Bill Buffalino, and Bill was, Bill was a talker. He was tied in with some interesting people, but he was Jimmy Hoffa's attorney and remained his attorney, as far as I know, for the rest of Jimmy's life. Now, here's the deal with this guy named Dave Beck. His presidency was troubled because Beck was already involved in some stuff that maybe he shouldn't have been involved in. And he actually had to appear. He was subpoenaed to appear in front of the U.S. Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management Fields. I will not repeat that. I hope you got it the first time.
Is this where he pled the fifth like 140 times?
Yeah. He pled the fifth 140 times when he was in front of this committee. which doesn't feel you would
Did
come.
he not just keep a count on it? Like, okay, I've done this a little too much.
Like
I need to, back off because this ain't looking good.
Well, some selectman was sitting over there like checking his shit off. Like, yep, got another one. He pulled full fifth on this select committee, which may have gotten him out of trouble in a very immediate way, but certainly did not get him out of trouble ultimately, because all that crashed and burned. Another problem with this is it caused a lot of your average Teamster guys to lose confidence.
I was going to say, were they going, wow, why did we change horses? We should have stayed with the old guy.
And that could have blown up on Jimmy too, because he backed this guy.
Yeah.
But fact is, Beck was indicted ultimately and convicted on several counts of fraud. But it did not blow up on Jimmy, luckily for him, because he, as soon as Beck was gone, he became president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters in 1957. So Beck's reign was like a term, basically. And then he was off to prison. And Jimmy was in the big seat. Now
maybe that was his plan.
Well, it could be very well. A lot of people did not like Jimmy Hoffa becoming president from start. And I'm not talking about the average. I'm not talking about your average Teamster who was on board with Jimmy. I'm talking about people in the government and people in certain regulatory organizations. For instance, there's the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. Woo!
Say that again.
I refuse. You're right. I refuse. They expelled the International Brotherhood of Teamsters from their organization, which was basically a large nationwide labor union organization. They protested Jimmy Hoffa from the start being the president. They didn't like him because I think they were probably looking at David Beck and going, this is David Beck's boy. And by the way, we've heard some things about you, Jimmy. So even though the International Brotherhood of Teamsters brought in $750,000 a year for that organization, which I will refuse to repeat the name of again, they expelled the Teamsters. But still, Jimmy won re-election twice more, actually. He won the election to become president in 1961 and then the term after that. But, by this point, charges against Jimmy were starting to mount up. He was charged with mail fraud several times, and probably the most important or serious charges he was starting to get was jury tampering, because Jimmy would get involved in these legal wranglings, and the juries would find him not guilty over and over and over again. The case would be dropped or whatever. And the guys trying to prosecute, they started to what is with this Jimmy? Like, why will nobody bring us a guilty verdict against Jimmy Hoffa, no matter what evidence we have to prove that he's involved with mail fraud? And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that he was, tampering with the jury. There was bribery going on in order for him to maintain his position and more importantly, probably to stay out of prison. And so the Teamsters convinced him to appoint a man named Frank Fitzsimmons to be his vice president, because they liked Frank Fitzsimmons and they thought, well, maybe he would be a good president. Let's just say Jimmy finally gets convicted, because how many times can you dodge a bullet, right? Mm-hmm. We wouldn't mind if Frank was his successor, I think was the idea. Because the thing about Jimmy, pretty much from jump, is he liked the power of it. He liked, having total control over the Teamsters, which during his presidency he did. And I think there were people even within the Teamster organization that thought maybe Jimmy had too much power.
Yeah.
And Frank Fitzsimmons, I think they looked at him and thought, I don't know if he's quite so power hungry, and maybe we can kind of get him to do stuff that Jimmy is like, no, I'm not going to do it, sort of thing. Now, there's another complication that came into play in 1960, because there was this guy, you may have heard of him, named John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Yeah, I think I've heard of him, yeah.
He got elected president, not of the Teamsters, but of the United States of America. And
Lord, if he had gotten nominated of the Teamsters.
I tell you what, he was going for the big job. And Kennedy got the big job, beating out Richard Nixon, who will come to play into this story here shortly. Now, John Kennedy had a brother named Bobby.
Oh, Bobby. Bobby did not like Hoffa, and I think the feeling was mutual.
Yeah.
They hated each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bobby was out to, I'm going to take this guy down. I'm going to be the one. And Hoffa's like, bring it, sucker.
He really was, like Hoffa had that Street Fighter mentality. It was like, what, you want to fight? I like to fight. Let's go.
What if they made like a Street Fighter game with like historical figures
I
that
would
actually
play it.
like went
Jimmy
up
Hoffa
versus Bobby Kennedy?
Fight.
And they have like moves.
Yeah. And then he gets hit and he's like, whoa.
Yes. That would be interesting, actually.
I would play that game.
Yeah.
That's true. Bobby had a lot to prove.
Hoffa has like the arguing
Mm-hmm.
power,
and
it knocks him out.
Right, and it just knocks everybody down.
Yeah.
And then his finishing move is he just shoots fire out of his mouth or some shit. That would be great. So the question became, would Bobby be able to succeed where so many others had failed? Would he be able to finally put away Jimmy Hoffa? Mm-hmm. It's worth noting, too, another thing, Jimmy, this goes back to John Kennedy. At the debate, famously, there are many famous things about the debate between Kennedy and Nixon, aside from Nixon's upper lip sweating.
Yes.
John Kennedy actually named Jimmy Hoffa during the debate, when he was speaking about corruption. And Jimmy was fit to be tied. He went all over the news, in every newspaper he could find, saying, how can you do this? How can a future president of the United States accuse a man who has not been convicted of any of these crimes, of being compliant in corruption, of being un-American? Because when Jimmy got on, when he had a bone, he was you couldn't get away from him. He was a dog with a bone, and when Kennedy said that on national television and radio, he got so pissed, and thus began the feud between Hoffa and at least two of the Kennedys. I don't know what he thought of Ted, but I know what I do. And but he did not like John and Bobby. Now, he thought that Bobby, in his words, was an entitled little runt. That's pretty much the best way that Hoffa could describe him, though he did describe him in many other ways that were a little more profane. And according to that attorney, the Buffalino guy, he said that Jimmy Hoffa, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, that Jimmy Hoffa wiretapped Marilyn Monroe's house in order to get dirt on Bobby Kennedy and John, if he could.
I've always heard her stuff was tapped. Some people thought it was,
his attorney,
FBI, CIA folks doing it, but
Hoffa's attorney claims that it was Jimmy Hoffa because he wanted more on the Kennedys, because he was taking the Kennedys down. That was his big thing. Night when JFK got assassinated, Hoffa came up to the Teamsters office there, the primary, his office, and they had the flag at half-mast. And he went apeshit. He went in there and he said, take that flag up. No flags will go half-mast in the Teamsters anywhere.
I'm surprised he didn't just go and do it.
What, kill JFK?
No. Go do the flag
well, he
himself.
might have
He's
done that.
Screw this. Down there.
Well, I can't say that he did.
Okay.
But he was livid that they would dare fly the flag at half-mast after what these Kennedys have done to him, and the Teamsters. But to him, because he hated them, Now, the thing about Jimmy's luck he was a pretty lucky man, but he made his own luck, I think, in a lot of ways, just from pure like blood, sweat, and tears. In 1964, his luck ran out. Chattanooga, Tennessee. He was convicted of bribing a juror in an earlier case. Now, the earlier case, which was thrown out, was he had been indicted on making loans to organized crime members, known organized crime bosses, from the Teamsters Pension Fund. So what Jimmy was doing is he was taking money out of the pensions of Teamsters and loaning it to the mafia. And that case got thrown out, and what they discovered was that Jimmy had bribed one of the jurors. And this time he got convicted of jury tampering, which got him an 8-year sentence. And then that the pension thing came back, and he got more time. A total of 13 years he was sentenced to prison, because these were going to run consecutively, not concurrently. Concurrently meaning the two sentences would be going on at the same time. He had to serve one, and then he had to serve the other. So when the mask fell, it made a loud crash. It really came down hard. And he started serving his sentence in March of 1967, in spite of many failed appeals, because he tried for quite some time to appeal this. But eventually, it was just everything was denied. So there was no getting out of it. So naturally, in prison, he wasn't president of the Teamsters anymore. Frank Fitzsimmons, who I mentioned before, his vice president, took over as acting president of the Teamsters.
Now, the guy that he had taken over for, was he still in prison at this point, or was he?
I'm not sure. You wondering if they were cellmates?
That would have been interesting.
Oh, yeah, talking about Dave Beck?
Yes.
I don't know. I don't think they were serving. I think Hoffa served up in Pennsylvania. Okay. I don't know where Dave Beck was.
Thought maybe they could be roomies or something.
That would be an interesting conversation. Like, I would like to write a play about them in the cell.
A good reality show.
It would be. The first reality show shot on actual film.
Could have been The Odd Couple.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one of the things that Fitzsimmons did, Bobby Kennedy. We'll throw one more little trivia bit about Bobby Kennedy in there. When this may just be a matter of timing, but as soon as Hoffa was actually convicted and went to prison, Bobby Kennedy mysteriously stepped down as Attorney General of the United States, and he went on to become a U.S. Senator. But
was that because of that, or was it because he and Lyndon didn't have the greatest relationship?
I think it was probably a matter of convenient timing. I think more it was because of Lyndon Johnson, who did not want Bobby as Attorney General, and couldn't fire Bobby or boot him because his brother had just been assassinated. So, and Bobby had a lot of enemies. He had the kind of personality, and I respect Bobby Kennedy, as you well know. Of the Kennedy boys, Bobby is my personal favorite. But Bobby had a way of making enemies. He made a huge enemy with Jimmy Hoffa, and Lyndon Johnson did not like him at all. But he had to keep him on for the aforementioned reason. So I think basically what did it for Bobby, because famously when Lyndon Johnson was going to be reelected, Bobby wanted to be the vice president. Yeah. And Lyndon came to him actually at the convention, the Democratic convention, I believe, and said, "It's not going to be you, Bobby." And the story is that, as Bobby was walking out of the door, he turned back and he said, "I could have won you a lot of votes." And he left. And that was pretty much the end of their relationship, professionally and otherwise. But anyway, while that was going on, Jimmy was in prison. And Frank Fitzsimmons was the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. And the one thing Frank Fitzsimmons started to do from Jump Street is decentralize the power in the Teamsters. Suddenly, the mantle that Jimmy was on started to be reduced. So the president of the Teamster had less and less powers as it went on, which is kind of what they predicted.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the government kind of wanted too.
Yeah.
They wanted somebody who would not be quite so, I don't want to say megalomaniacal, but be quite so power hungry.
Yeah.
At the head of what was one of the country, or what still is one of the country's, most powerful labor unions. Now, he didn't serve the full 13 years. He served 5 of 13 years. And now we're going to get into another presidential controversy. He was released on December 23rd of 1971, Jimmy. His sentence was commuted as time served by the current president of the United States, who was Richard Nixon. This was kind of controversial. And come to find out, there may have been some behind-the-scenes politics going on. Jimmy was given a one-time lump sum payment for his pension of $1.7 million, which had never been done before. And he, as I said, was no longer president of the Teamsters. Part of the presidential, it's not really a pardon, the sentence was commuted. Yeah. The deal worked out by Nixon was that until the year 1980, Jimmy Hoffa could not have any affiliation with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. So it was effectively a retirement. And they gave him this lump sum. And I think the lump sum was, thanks, Jimmy. Now go be quiet.
So thanks for the memories.
Yeah, thanks for the memories. We got Fitzsimmons as our president now. We're fine with that. The government seems to be fine with that. The heat is off of us. So here's a bunch of money that you earned. It's your pension. We're going to give it to you, and now we want you to go away. But
that wasn't good enough, was it?
It wasn't good enough.
Not good enough. Nope.
I should say that mysteriously, Nixon was up for re-election, and right before Hoffa's sentence was commuted, Nixon received a very mysterious $1 million payment for his re-election campaign. So I think maybe, somebody was helping Jimmy out, getting him out of prison. But Jimmy didn't realize, because Jimmy later said that if he knew part of the deal was that his hands would be tied when it came to working with Teamsters, he would have just served the sentence. He didn't know about this, apparently, the caveat that you cannot have anything to do with the Teamsters. Because Jimmy thought he was going to get out of prison and get his job back.
Yeah, no.
And that was part of the deal that Nixon pulled, and actually Jimmy Hoffa sued the government over this. Because he said that, that's unconstitutional. A president cannot tell a private citizen that he can't have any job in America that he wants. And he said it was unconstitutional. He was not aware of that clause in the deal, and that he would not have taken it if he had known it. This was an unsuccessful legal wrangling lawsuit. But during this time, he was occupying himself with other things.
Yeah, because he was trying to get his job back, but at the same time, he's writing a book.
Yes.
He's writing his autobiography.
Mm-hmm.
Was it Hoffa, The Real Story?
Yes, Hoffa, Hoffa, The Real Story. And that book was released.
After
what happened happened.
Yes.
And now I guess we'll talk about what happened.
Yeah.
So keep in mind, Hoffa is working to get his job back. He's suing the government. He said Nixon screwed him over. He would have served his sentence like a man if he had known all this stuff about not being able to be in the Teamsters anymore.
Well, I'm sure now he wished he'd have served his sentence.
Yeah. Yeah, he was, as usual, causing a lot of waves and making a lot of press that I think some people maybe didn't like. He tried to go to a couple different people to see if they could help him get his old job back. One of those people was a guy named Anthony Provenzano. And Provenzano was not a big fan of Hoffa. I don't know why Jimmy went to him or trusted him. But he just said, absolutely not. I'm not helping you with that. Because, the corruption within the Teamsters had a lot to do with this pension fund and the loans being made out to the mafia. I think with Fitzsimmons, there was a little bit more of an idea that we can push him around.
Yeah.
And I think what while Jimmy was in prison, what some mafia people realized, people like Provenzano, was
like this.
Yeah, it's like kind of easier to just be able to get what we want. Because Jimmy would stand up to like some mafia guy and say, "No, you're not going to do that. I'm not doing that. He probably should have done that more, but he did it a lot. So he was like a pushback, and he was not a pushover. And that may have been part of why Provenzano and the commission in New York didn't really like all this guff that he was throwing about not being president of the Teamsters and about Nixon and all that. Now, some people have said that Hoffa was willing to strike a deal with the government secretly and be kind of like an informant. If he could get this provision reversed and become president of the Teamsters again, he would tell the Justice Department anything they wanted to know about the mafia, because he knew a lot, having worked with them for so many years. And that
Why didn't he just save it for the book?
He saved it for the book.
Saved it for the book.
Well,
went on the Today Show.
The problem is this stuff gets around.
Yeah.
And in Washington, there's no such thing as a secret, as we all know. You can buy a secret, but you can't really keep one without a lot of money or political pull. So July 30th, 1975, Hoffa wrote down in his date book that he was going to go meet Provenzano and one of Provenzano's associates at a place called the Red Fox Restaurant, which was in a little suburb of Detroit, Bloomfield Township, which was not far from where he lived. He stopped by a friend of his who had helped to arrange this meeting, a man who owned a limousine service, but that man was gone out to lunch. This was shortly after 1:15 p.m. in the afternoon of July the 30th, 1975. And then after that, when he saw that his friend was on lunch, he just went straight to the Red Fox. And many eyewitnesses saw him in the parking lot, standing by his car, pacing around, looking more and more agitated. Now, an hour after he left home at 2:15, he called up his wife, Josephine, and he was, again, fit to be tied. He said, "They're standing me up."
That should have been the title of his autobiography.
Fit to be tied. Hoffa, fit to be tied. But Josephine says that he told her, they stood me up. I'm not going to be here. I'm not going to stand around and wait for them all day. Do you know who I am? You come to me. I don't go to you. You stand up Jimmy Hoffa. He was pissed. He said, "Honey, put on the stakes. I'm going to be home by 4 p.m. And he hung up the phone. That was the last time she ever spoke to him. Now, he did make one other call to someone, and we're not quite sure who that was. But 4 p.m. is the last time anyone absolutely, for sure, heard from Jimmy Hoffa. A couple eyewitnesses, actually, a couple guys, truck drivers, came out of the Red Fox, and they saw Jimmy Hoffa in the parking lot. They recognized him. They walked over to shake his hand, introduce themselves, because, it's Jimmy Hoffa. He used to be president of the Teamsters. We're truck drivers. Yeah. And,
he gave him a ride once, and he gave me a car.
Yeah, I remember you. And so, he was cordial to them and shook their hands, as he generally was to, Teamsters. I mean, he's not, but he was pissed about being stood up by Provenzano. So he stopped to shake their hand. Now, 7 a.m. the following morning, Josephine realizes Hoffa never came home last night. So she calls her son or daughter, and it tells them that. A friend of his, actually the guy that owned the limousine service that he went by to talk to, who was on lunch, he went over to the restaurant and he found Jimmy's car unlocked, unmolested, undisturbed, no sign of a struggle or anything like that, but the car was still in the Red Fox parking lot. And then that night, Jimmy's son, James, filed the missing persons report. Now, naturally, they're going to ask questions to Provenzano because that's who Jimmy was going to go meet. Provenzano claims he did not have a meeting with Jimmy that day. that he had no idea what they were talking about. And he had an alibi that put him nowhere near the Red Fox. Of course, Provenzano would not be anywhere near the Red Fox if something was to happen, would he? But he claims that there was never any sort of a meeting. Hoffa was declared legally dead in July 30th, 1982, which was, to the day of the anniversary of his disappearance. Now, this leads into probably one of the most interesting unsolved mysteries in the 20th century. Cue Robert Stack.
Yes.
And the music. I wish we had the music, but there's rights issues.
Yeah.
I would just click that right now.
Yeah.
And a little thing would fly across the screen and said missing person and fly over our shoulder.
That's right.
Right back there.
Should have like a Robert Stack poster behind us.
Yeah, like in the whole,
His
trench coat, and we could have a smoke machine over here.
Yeah.
God, that would be awesome. You give me such great ideas. But anyway, we'll talk about some of the theories about Jimmy's disappearance. 2001, a hair was found in a car of an associate of Jimmy's, a guy named Chucky O'Brien. The Hoffa family, for many, many years, thought that Chucky O'Brien had something to do with his disappearance. This hair that was in his car was matched to Hoffa. It's his DNA. It's absolutely his hair. Chucky O'Brien said that Hoffa had never been in his car, which seems pretty stupid.
Well, was he like a cat? He just like rubbed on people.
And his little short hair came out from his military-style haircut. No, but I mean, think about that. Chucky O'Brien was a dear friend of Hoffa's. If you said he was in my car and they found the hair in your car, that doesn't mean that he disappeared.
Yeah, he could just say, yeah,
he's been in my car many times.
We went to the pizza place the other night.
So saying that the hair was not his is when it was. Yeah. It just seems like kind of a stupid. It's a stupid thing to say on his part. If he is completely, not guilty. Yeah. That doesn't sound good.
But he's making himself look fishy.
He's very fishy. Did I serve fish at the Red Fox? There's a book called I Heard You Paint Houses, written by a guy named Charles Brandt. And it's pretty famous. Martin Scorsese is about to make a movie out of it called The Irishman. A 3-hour plus movie I can't wait to see. Starring Robert De Niro as a guy named Frank Sheeran. And Al Pacino is Jimmy Hoffa, Joe Pesci, Harvey Keitel. Joe Pesci's coming out of retirement. Yeah. It's great.
I can see Joe Pesci as Hoffa.
He would have been a good Hoffa. Yeah, I mean, Al Pacino is short, like Hoffa was, but then again, so was Joe Pesci.
So when you said Joe Pesci, I was like, he would have been.
That's a good point. That's actually a really good point. I never thought about that. But this guy Frank, he was a hitman. He was a professional hitman for the mafia, a known associate, and he. In this book, I Heard You Paint Houses, because that was like a euphemism. That's how people would contact him, Frank, and they would say, hey, I heard you paint houses. And what that meant was, so I heard you'll kill people for money, huh? And so that was sort of like his calling card. Frank says that Chucky O'Brien brought Jimmy Hoffa in a car to a house in Detroit. And Chucky left and Jimmy went inside and Frank was inside. Frank said he invited Jimmy in, said, hey, how you doing? And as soon as Jimmy turned around in the foyer, he pulled out a gun, shot him behind the right ear. And he said Hoffa fell to the ground and blood went all over the foyer floor. Now, you probably have heard of this story prior to the movie being, in the book.
Yeah, I have heard that one.
Because this led them to actually go into that house and look on that floor and find a massive amount of blood, the residue of a massive amount of blood. They tested this blood, and it was not Jimmy Hoffa's DNA. So that begs the question, whose blood is on the floor? Somebody got killed in that fucking foyer.
What if they just killed a bunch of people that way, and then it just all kind of
mingled together? Yeah. No, it wasn't Jimmy's Hoffa's blood. So does that mean that Frank did not murder Jimmy Hoffa? No. Personally, I think the Chucky O'Brien guy, I think he might have had a little something to do with this. Because what it sounds like to me is that Jimmy was in that parking lot really, really pissed.
And his friend pulls up.
And it's somebody he trusted. And the friend probably goes, hey, they wanted me to come get you, and we're going to go. And Jimmy got in the car and went, hence no sign of a struggle, and went voluntarily somewhere with Chucky O'Brien. And something happened, whether it be Frank shooting him behind the ear, which if he did that, it wasn't in that house.
No.
You remember the show a couple weeks ago we did on Richard Kuklinski?
Mm-hmm.
He says he has his own Hoffa thing because, you know, he was involved with the mob. He says that they took Jimmy Hoffa, killed him, put him in a barrel, and burned him for about an hour. And he said after that, they buried him in a shallow grave. And then Kuklinski said that after he was buried there for a while, they were like, they might find him. So they dug him up, put him in a car compactor, crushed him down to like a 3-inch cube with a bunch of metal, and sent the metal to Japan to be smelted into car fenders and things. That was Kuklinski's story. Now, Kuklinski, that might have just been one of his crazy fucking fantasies, because you might want to go back and watch that show that we did. He had a lot of theories about how to kill and torture people, and he put it into practice quite a bit. That's what Kuklinski said happened to Jimmy Hoffa. Other people have claimed that he is in the concrete beneath Giant Stadium.
Yeah, and his attorney, Bill Buffalino, that you were talking about earlier, he claims that the CIA had him killed because Hoffa knew about a plot to use the mob to, kill Castro.
Oh, to kill Castro.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, the CIA, we were talking about this before, they were training. Apparently, it is a fact. I don't know. I don't want to speak out of turn. But that they were training Cuban exiles to go back in and kill Fidel Castro. Because the CIA obviously wanted Fidel Castro dead. The mafia hated Fidel Castro because the mafia, Meyer Lansky, guys like that were making bank in Havana with a lot of illegally rigged casinos. And they were making so much damn money. And then this whole Batista thing happens, and then Fidel Castro takes over, and Fidel Castro runs all of the organized crime out of Cuba. So the mafia definitely had a reason to not like Fidel Castro. I mean, the government tried and the mafia, I believe, tried many, many times to assassinate him. Fidel Castro was like the cat with 9 lives. Like, he just always seemed to get out of assassination plots, He was like Hitler when he was younger. They'd send him into battle, and like, why did this skinny little bastard survive all these suicide missions? Some horrible people just have the best luck in the world. It's amazing. Like, really good people will die like that.
Yeah.
And you get all these horrible people, and you can try to kill them like 5 ways from Sunday, and you can't do it. They're like fucking Rasputin.
And they're kind of like really like not even noticing people are like flying around. It's like Mr. Bean like walking through. And things falling. And
it's like a Charlie Chaplin movie with these people. But anyway, a little side note. So I mean, the mafia trying to kill Fidel Castro is not an unusual idea. I don't know if I believe that Hoffa was, because it seems like, that was going on for a while. So why didn't they just kill Jimmy
when he was in prison?
Or soon, even before, because he would have already known about it then, right?
How would they have gotten him out of prison, the U.S. government?
I don't know.
It was
and
just leave him there.
People talk a lot about, obviously both the Kennedy boys were assassinated, and people talk about Jimmy knowing something about them, their assassinations.
And he was writing a book.
He was writing a book, which came out. Maybe they redacted everything in the book.
It's like a lot of.
Yeah, like people, like his family were looking through it, like, oh, nope, we're not really putting that page in. JFK, oh, Dallas, nope. Cuba. So we only got like the Cliff Notes version of Jimmy Hoffa, the real story. We got Jimmy Hoffa, half the story.
Yes.
But no, we don't know that. We're just joking. We don't know that that's actually true. I don't know that he knew anything about the Kennedy boys. Like, Bobby was murdered while he was in prison. Obviously, JFK was murdered quite a few years before he went to prison.
Yeah.
He did not shed any tears over either, I think is safe to say. Now, if you believe, we did a whole show on the JFK assassination conspiracies, and if you believe, that the mafia had something to do with JFK, which my opinion on it, I'm not a big conspiracy theorist guy, but if you did subscribe to the mafia killed JFK or had something to do with it, that they were in cahoots with the CIA or whoever, then you might be able to make a case, well, Jimmy knew something about it either before or after or during, because Jimmy knew just about everybody in the country when it came to mafia bosses. He had cut a deal with the best of them. But, again, going back even to his disappearance, it's all speculation. We don't know. Do you think we'll ever know what happened to Jimmy Hoffa?
No.
Yeah, I think at this point,
a lot of them are dead now.
Yeah. Well, it's like Provenzano. He died of heart failure in 1988. So if he did indeed have something to do with Hoffa's murder, and it seems to me of all the organized crime people, he may have wanted to murder Hoffa the most. He once said that if Hoffa becomes president of the Teamsters again, he would rip his guts right out of his stomach. That sounds to me like a threat.
Maybe just a light one.
Mild threat.
Yeah, mild.
Yeah, but from Provenzano, I would take that threat seriously.
Yeah.
But if he knew anything about it, his heart gave out on him in 1988. So he took it to the grave. There have been many, many deathbed confessions. People like Kuklinski, if you're going to die and you want notoriety in your last days, either say you know what happened to Jimmy Hoffa or that you're the Zodiac Killer.
What about O'Brien?
Chucky O'Brien?
Yeah.
I don't know if he's still alive or not. I'm not sure about Chucky. At last I heard he was still alive because he was a younger man back then.
Okay.
He wasn't like Hoffa's age. I think he was a little bit closer to the son's age.
Okay.
Now, speaking of Jimmy's family, Josephine never recovered after Jimmy disappeared, as is generally the case with people who have been married for a long time. Obviously, they were happily married. I think, it really seems that Jimmy's family life was very separate from all of the stuff he did,
his
the money,
shenanigans,
the other stuff. Yeah, because his children love him and his wife loved him, and his wife loved him so much that basically she died of a broken heart not long after in 1980. So it was just a couple months after he was legally declared dead, Josephine died. Now his daughter, Barbara, she went on to be an associate circuit judge in St. Louis County, Missouri. And after that, she served as the chief counsel of the Division of Civil Disability and Workers' Rights. So Jimmy would be quite proud, I think. Now, I think the even more amazing thing is that the current president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters is James P. Hoffa, Jimmy's son.
Huh.
And James P. Hoffa has been president of the Teamsters since 1999. He is the second longest running president ever in the Teamsters history, second only to the original fella. So, it all kind of ties back together. So I think it's safe to say Jimmy would be smiling from wherever he is with Josephine. I have a lot of mixed feelings about the thing. Honestly, I do respect Jimmy Hoffa. I think he did bad things. I go back and forth. I think that overall, what he did in terms of I think what he was saying was correct. I think that the way he executed things was incorrect, in a lot of instances.
Do you think he maybe thought that was the only way he could get things done?
Yeah.
At the speed that he felt they needed to be done?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think
Dance with the Devil in the Pale Moonlight, that whole thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that he was a straight guy, and he knew how to strong arm people, and he knew that sometimes, you have to have the bark and the bite. And I think ultimately it might have bitten him. I think maybe if he had gotten out of prison, taken that lump sum pension payment over almost $2 million, and, in the late 70s, you could live a long time on $2 million, especially if you invested it well. And he was already an older man at that point. You know, him and Josephine could have lived the rest of their lives.
It doesn't mean he just wouldn't have been president. I mean, he could have still, written books and,
That's right.
and been very vocal
and he could have waited.
Yeah.
Because this was not an indefinite provision in the commuting of his sentence. He only had to wait until 1980. And then he would be allowed legally, as part of the deal, to run for president, to get his old job back, but he just couldn't wait. And he just had to have that back. Maybe because it was so much a part of his identity.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I think if Jimmy had
He just focused on his book.
Yeah.
Maybe went on some shows and did the, hey, I'm a talking head on this show and I'm talking about union stuff, and then let it cool.
Go on Carson.
Redeem himself.
Tell Dick Cavett all about it.
That's right.
I would love to see that. In fact, I think he was on Dick Cavett. But anyway, let me just say this. In fact, I know he was. But let me just say this. I think Jimmy Hoffa was an interesting man. I think that the mystery ultimately of his disappearance and obviously death, by now he's long gone, will always endure. So you'll always remember Jimmy Hoffa.
So, you'll never forget who he was,
And who knows, one day they might be able to figure out some kind of weird DNA thing we might know. Probably not in my lifetime or yours, but I don't know. Things are progressing pretty quickly. I would love to know what happened to Jimmy.
Maybe old O'Brien, if he's not dead,
on his deathbed, he'll finally give it up. But hey, before we head out, let's talk about your channel real quick.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you have 2 channels.
I do. I have a music channel, Rivey Girl Music, on YouTube, and then I have another one. It's called Rivey Girl Fitness. Right now, it's basically foods that are good for you. He's on a recent episode called What's the Tea, where we talk about matcha tea because I'm obsessed with matcha.
And I tried it for the first time.
Yes, and he tried it for the first time, and we got his reaction.
I'll try, and in the YouTube, I'll link to that video, and you can go over and check out the video that we did together for her channel, get my reaction to my first time trying matcha, and subscribe and like. And
I'm also on Instagram. So find me on Instagram, and in the bios, I usually put links up.
Yes.
To those new videos.
And that's how you would be able to find it. So go on over, check out her stuff. And don't forget, speaking of upcoming things, I'm about to release the date. Not yet. You're about to hear the release date for my book of short story collections, Grimoire, which is coming out at the end of this month. And within a few days, you're going to know exactly when it's going to come out. So, and also you might be getting some cover art too. So it's pretty exciting for the both of us. Go check out what she's doing. I hope you check out what I'm doing beyond just this show. And until next week, take care of yourselves.